The Toronto Blue Jays had one of the greatest seasons in recent memory, but they did not win a playoff game. That's something we're going to talk about in the 2023 team preview of the Toronto Blue Jays. Sean coming back to his very own podcast for this team preview. Let's break it down here at OBP. Sean, welcome back to your podcast. Joining me yet again, my co-host, Sean Doyle, here from Jays from the Couch. You had to come and join me for some of these team previews. I know you kind of stepped back a little bit to work on Jays from the Couch and let me do my work on these team previews as we're getting ready for opening day, but there was no other person in this entire world that I would want to talk Blue Jays with than you, so welcome back.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to be back. You're killing it with those team previews. So I was itching to get a shot just to get in on a little bit of it. So I'm glad to be here.
Well, let's do that. Let's do exactly just that. That's what we're going to talk about, the Toronto Blue Jays. Now, so much has gone on this season, or this off season, if you will, as well for the Blue Jays. But I want to go even farther back and talk about the 2022 season real quick. You covered this team in depth over on Jays from the Couch last season and plenty of years from just covering the Blue Jays over at Jays from the Couch. Last year, 92-70 was the Blue Jays, 7 games out of first place, but still good enough to make the playoffs. However, got to add that caveat, I think. They get swept by the Seattle Mariners. They did not look good in the playoffs. That is something that has been a little asterisk, if you will, as of late. These Blue Jays are a team that you say, this is a World Series champion team, but they can't get that next step into the playoffs. Your perspective, as someone who covers the Blue Jays almost every single day of the week, take me back to 2022.
Yeah, it was a great season. I think there were a lot of expectations after the previous, missing the postseason by one game. So that was, a bit of a gut punch. And so the off season, we were like, everybody's excited and this could be the year. And then the Yankees get off to a phenomenal start, probably like April, May. And into June, and then the Jays just couldn't quite make up that difference. Firing their manager partway through the season in Charlie Montoyo and bringing in John Schneider, and at that point, from that point on, they played like a house on fire. And if the season were only that long, they would have won the division. But alas, it was not. And so the Yankees, they did their Yankee thing somehow, and then so we have to be content with a wild card spot, and then you have the Seattle Mariners, and on paper it looks like a good matchup for the Toronto Blue Jays, and it was anything but. It was game one was kind of. It is what it is, understandable. But then game two, it just you have an 8-run lead, and then it just all dissipates, and you got guys running into each other, and your center fielder getting a concussion, and shortstop forgetting where shortstop actually ends, and all of that. It was just a hot mess. So it left a pretty bitter taste in a lot of people's mouth. That's for sure. But I think the one thing that it did do was it left a bitter taste in the front office's mouth, and it kind of prompted them to really look at addressing specific needs so that they don't have to repeat their same fate in 2023.
Yeah, it seems like it lit a fire under the front office, and we're going to get to those moves from this offseason. But before we do, I do want to talk about John Schneider. Obviously, no longer having that interim tag in front of his name. He is the manager for the Toronto Blue Jays. How do you feel about him leading the clubhouse in 2023?
Love it. Absolutely love it. John Schneider's got a relationship with the core players going all the way back to Double-A. He won a championship with them as well. And so he's kind of come up with them. But the one thing that he has going for him is that he, is not afraid to try new things to push the envelope a little bit to get an extra win in the column. But he also has high expectations for his players. And I think now what you've seen really is the transition from let's figure out how to win at the big league level. And now we're transitioning to let's win a championship. And those two are very different things. You're kind of learning the game under Charlie Montoyo. But now that John Schneider's in there, it's all about winning and doing everything they can to win. And they've got the right guy in there because he'll hold the players accountable, but also he'll try different things. And he's not afraid to mix and match and do different lineups and things like that. that are just all designed to get that extra 90 feet and the extra win and all of that.
Well, with rule changes, everything else coming in between, this team is still a powerhouse. And as we mentioned earlier, this front office, it seems like lit a fire under the rest of the organization and made some drastic moves this offseason. And I will say drastic. I don't feel bad saying that word because I know there's a lot of fans out there that are still upset. I know some of your coworkers over at Jace from the Couch are upset about some of the moves
Yeah.
as well. So take me through the offseason, and let's really start at the trades first because it looks like Toronto made a lot of trades, including some of the top prospects, some players that were a staple on their team in the starting lineup for quite some time. Regardless of the fact, this is going to be a different yet possibly stronger Toronto Blue Jays in 2023.
Yeah, I think the off season started by trading away Teoscar Hernandez, one of the the more popular faces in that clubhouse for a number of years, and and a really big middle of the order bat as well. So that was a bit of a gut punch to watch that take place, especially when the return is a reliever and another pitching prospect, Adam Macko, who lots of people are high on, but when you're looking at the Teoscar Hernandez and Eric Swanson and Adam Macko, it kind of does. It felt very much in the early hours of that deal. It very much felt lopsided. But then you start peeling back the layers. Teoscar Hernandez was set to make $14.5 million in arbitration, and that was now the Seattle Mariners' problem, and it turned out to be a little bit of a problem for them as well, as they couldn't come to an agreement. So, the money side of it was kind of the I guess a necessary evil, but to start the offseason, taking away a significant bat and adding a bullpen piece, that was is an interesting way to get things going, but obviously it created a bunch of holes that needed to be fixed in a number of different ways, which is what I think made the offseason so great, because in that moment it was a terrible offseason, because it created a bunch of holes and kind of left you scratching your head. But obviously there was a bigger picture at play, and it seems to be completed now.
Yeah, with the addition as well as Dalton Varsho coming over from
Right.
Arizona, that was probably the another move of scanning. Okay, this is when I talk about thinking they might be stronger this year. That's what I think about because of Dalton Varsho. Now you did have to get rid of a player in your future that some people think might be a really top end catcher for years to come. When you talk about this Arizona team, I can't wait to get that team preview because it's just going to be a youth explosion. But however, you get Dalton Varsho coming into that team, adding in to a great outfield already. What do you think about adding him in 2023?
Yeah, I mean, at first it was one of those things that was weird because Toronto had three catchers that they could, three big league ready catchers that they could have
Absolutely.
dealt, and all of them have their kind of, their pluses and their minuses, and they're all valuable in different ways. And it was a bit of a surprise to see them kind of go with trading away Gabriel Moreno, who's the best catching prospect in all of baseball. It was interesting to see that, and then adding Lourdes Gurriel on top of it. It felt like a bit of an overpay, but again, the Blue Jays are set at the catcher position in Danny Jansen and Alejandro Kirk. That's probably the best catching duo in baseball. So I mean, it's funny to criticize a move, when the reality is what you're left with is still really, really good. And then, of course, adding Dalton Varsho and his defense out in the outfield and the ability to back up at the catching position as well. I think it was, and this lefty bat element too. The Blue Jays have been looking for a lefty bat for so long. So I think there's a lot of things that kind of made the deal makes sense again when you stop and think about it. But the initial kind of sticker shock, it was pretty intense, much like Teoscar Hernandez. But again, both of them, when you stop and peel back the layers, it actually, both of them make a lot of sense in the I guess in the sense of a good baseball trade. It benefited both teams. The Diamondbacks are going to enjoy that duo that they got there as well, for this year. And then if they can keep Gurriel for longer, great. But they're definitely going to enjoy Gabriel Moreno for sure.
Couple free agents for the Blue Jays as well. Obviously, that they were very busy. One of the busiest teams in the offseason. I would say probably the busiest competitive team in the offseason, if I had to make that right here on this podcast. But also Chris Bassett coming in free agency, going to add to that rotation. and you also get Kevin Kiermaier playing what looks like be center field. George Springer moving to right, which could
Mhm.
be a really good thing. One of the most underrated pickups because it might keep George Springer in a lot longer because that dude just plays with a vengeance. I think his motor's just he doesn't know how to stop. He doesn't know how to
That's
play
right.
the game any slower. It's not a bad thing, but when you put all that money and stock into a guy like George Springer, you want to be able to
Mhm.
hopefully get him in for 120 games. So maybe right field will work for him in that case. But take me through Kiermaier. Obviously, Chris Bassett's a huge addition. Your
Mhm.
free agencies were also a nice addition for Toronto this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think going to Kevin Kiermaier, I think the highlight, I guess, is the run prevention that he brings. The best center fielder in the last 10 years easily, and so I think that defensive element to his game, anything else he contributes is just gravy. It's icing on the cake because they brought him in to shore up the defense, because run prevention was something that they have been harping on this front office for quite a while, all off season, especially given the fact that they traded away a lot of offensive depth. They better start. They got to cling to something. Like, oh no, we're after run prevention this time, guys.
Yeah.
Okay, great, great. Well then, how do you do that? You add probably the best defensive center fielder in the game when he's healthy. And so that'll be a huge, huge bonus. And then, of course, just the ability to keep George Springer healthy, though moving him to right field where he's surrounded by yet another wall. I'm not sure if if I'm super comfortable with that. If his style of play really matches having more walls around him, but. Obviously, the demand of the position is a little bit less than it would be in center field, and so that whole outfield, the defensive, it very well could be the best defensive outfield in baseball. And then, of course, adding Chris Bassett. What's really interesting about him is that he doesn't necessarily need to be a Cy Young candidate or anything like that. All he has to do is keep doing what he's been doing his whole career thus far, and he'll be exactly what the Toronto Blue Jays needed. They've already got Alek Manoah and Kevin Gausman, and if Jose Barrios can somehow bounce back, they don't really need a Chris Bassett to jump in there and kind of lead the rotation. Just so happens that he, on any given day, he very well could put forward a start or two that does that. So the rotation itself is just that much deeper. And so I think what you're looking at is a Toronto Blue Jays team that was very clearly designed addressing very specific needs, as opposed to other teams like the Mets who are just collecting as much talent as they can. The Padres, and that's great. They do their thing, but the Blue Jays were more methodical, I think, about their approach this offseason. And I think when you look around, looking at the defensive, defensive alignments, lineup possibilities, adding those lefty bats of Kiermaier and Varsho, it just makes everything that much longer. And so there are very few kind of question marks on this Blue Jays roster. Sure, the rotation probably, with Yusei Kikuchi and whatever he's going to do, and can Barrios bounce back? But when you look at it, there aren't a whole lot of needs on this team as opposed to others where they're weak in several areas. I think the Blue Jays have put a lot of effort into being strong in a lot of areas.
Even with the question marks at the back end of the rotation, I think that Toronto's rotation is one of the most underrated in all of baseball, especially now with adding a Chris Bassett. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's three players. Your top three could be an ace on any other team. Well, at least half of the other teams in the league. I'm sure plenty of people would take a Gosman, a Manoah, or a Bassett any day of the week, and you get a chance to have them go back to back to back in a
Mm-hmm.
series. I mean, that's just if you're talking about getting yourself set up for a playoff run and getting ready and trying to get that playoff win that we keep talking about on this show, having a 1, 2, 3 like a Gosman, Manoah, and Bassett doesn't seem too bad at all. All right.
No, and you got to get to the postseason, right? And the one thing that you look at, everybody is healthy. They make their starts, which is something that I think the Blue Jays are also well aware of. If you look around baseball and all the starting rotations, and the Yankees already, their rotation is starting to
Right.
have like
Yeah.
some serious concerns, right? And so first and foremost, the Blue Jays are going to have guys who will give them 25 plus 30 starts, right? And that's huge when you're trying to make a playoff run.
Yeah, I love that you also brought up the word run prevention a few times
Mhm.
because that definitely was the buzzword of the Blue Jays this offseason. Now that we're moving into spring training, Baseball Classic, all that good stuff, and seeing some Blue Jays across, obviously playing for their home countries, and then obviously we're seeing them in spring training right now down in Florida. What are you catching from the Toronto players right now? What position battles are really sticking out to you? What's the new buzzword, I guess, in Toronto for spring training?
Man, that's a good question. The new buzzword in Toronto, I think, is just versatility. Maybe, and I don't know that anybody's necessarily talking about that outwardly and using like hashtag versatility, but they are talking about it kind of if you read between the lines. Like they're talking about how good their lineup is. Brandon Belt was on the broadcast the other day and just talking about he felt that this was the best place for him to win a championship,
Wow.
and that's why he signed in Toronto, knowing full well that he's got Vladdy at first base, taking all the reps there, and so he'd have to DH most of the time. Knowing that, he still chose Toronto for that reason. And I think when you start listening to what the players are saying, they're talking about just how good each other is, not necessarily about themselves, but just how good the team is, and they're learning how to kind of work together and feed off of each other. So I think that versatility in not only the positions that they can play, because you've got a lot of guys who can play multiple positions. Santiago Espinal is probably the best example of that. He'll just go in there and give you everything he's got, and you won't miss a beat. If Bo Bichette is out for a day or whatever have you, Santiago Espinal adds that depth. And so I think that that's the one thing that I think when I listen to them and I hear everybody talk about them, it's just that really they're just good and deep. And and I think that kind of boils down to that versatility that there isn't a weak spot really all over that diamond, and I think that's what they're most excited about.
Bo Bichette. We like talking
Hmm.
about Bo Bichette on this podcast. You and I both do. We're both big fans of him. But obviously, there's some defensive concerns last year. I know on your show you always love making the joke that Vladdy needs to buy Bo a new car for getting him the Golden Glove. However, with these new rule changes coming into play, bigger bases, his defense could be different. We could see some improvements. I think we're also going to see some improvements of him coming back with stolen bases on the offensive side. What's your thoughts about a 2023 Bo Bichette? Is this a guy that can get back into a possibly MVP consideration?
Ooh, that's interesting because a couple of years ago I actually picked him to win the MVP award, and then his defense was what it was. I think with Bo, first of all, the limiting the shift I think is going to be a positive for him because I think a lot of his errors in the past few years have been trying to rush throws that he probably shouldn't have made, and if you aren't having to run all over the field, I think that kind of limits the number of opportunities where he's going to get those questionable throws. I think that's the first thing. Maybe bigger bases mean that there are fewer close plays like they would have been last season, but there are always going to be close plays, whether they're 3 inches shorter or longer. It doesn't matter. Um, so I think that's the one thing that I'm going to be watching for. It's actually just his decision making. Bo is somebody like George Springer, like all of them. They want to be in a position where they can win, and they want to be the guy to deliver that win and every single thing they do. And I think Bo, a part of what his work will be is the mental side of the errors and just kind of making the right decisions, throwing when when you actually have a chance, as opposed to throwing it all the time and just hoping that it goes somewhere near Vladdy's glove.
Well, this team is still very young. And we talk about
Yeah.
Vlad Guerrero Jr., we talk about Bo Bichette. There's a whole bunch of young guys still on this roster. Doesn't stop us from still paying attention to these prospects coming up in Toronto. With MLB TV this year, they're giving the minor league package away for free. So I'm encouraging everyone when we're putting out these team previews, Sean, to watch minor league baseball. So, with that
Mhm.
being said, what are some players, some minor league prospects, if you will, out of Toronto that might make a major league debut, so be worth paying attention to them early in the year, or just somebody maybe at a lower level even that are worth the buzz and worth watching in the minors?
Yeah, I think I think what you're going to see is Addison Barger has had an awesome spring training, and kind of really put himself in the conversation of impacting Matt Chapman and his future with the team too, right? Because he's in his final year, and up until about 2 months ago, I was pushing like extend him, extend him, extend him because there's nobody else to take over third base. Now here comes Addison Barger having a great spring training and putting his name in the conversation. Does that change how the negotiations with Matt Chapman go? Does it maybe even eliminate negotiations with Matt Chapman altogether? Who knows? I think what we're going to see is we're going to see more time in the minors for Barger, and then at some point you will see him up in this season, and then I think that'll have a huge impact on what they do with Matt Chapman, because Chapman's 33, he's getting older, and the hot corner is not a place for for guys who are getting older. Just ask Adrian Beltre. I remember him in the 2015 playoffs. He was like just kicking the ball. His back was so bad. Like that's and it's very relatable, but you know, I don't necessarily feel good about extending Matt Chapman for 6 more years, let's say, which is what it might take. And so it's good to have somebody like Addison Barger. And then there are two guys who everybody should be paying attention to. I know Blue Jays fans are certainly excited about them. Ricky Tiedemann and Oscar Zulueta are two guys who Zulueta could be in the bullpen. Probably right out of spring training, won't be, but he could be. He's that good, but I think you'll see him later on. Excuse me, in the summer, hopefully later in the summer, and everybody's healthy, and it doesn't necessitate an early call up. But the same thing for Tiedemann as well. He'll be looked at as a starting option. So again, I think a lot has to go wrong for that to be pushed up. But I think maybe a September call up for him as well, depending on how his season goes. But for all three of them, there's a spot in the not too distant future in this Blue Jays roster. And I think a lot of that will, I guess, how wide open that spot is depends on how they do this coming season. But those are three names everybody should be watching.
See, even with a competitive team like Toronto, there's always room for prospects, so it's always
Mm-hmm.
worth watching this. There's injuries, unfortunately. There's players that can make splashes. I mean, look at the Braves. I mean, look at the Braves and what they did.
Yeah.
There's no different with other teams here like Toronto. All right, let's wrap this out together. I want to get your predictions here, Sean. 92 and 70 last year. It was good enough for second place in the American League East behind the Yankees. They did get to the playoffs. We all know what happened after that. I think we've talked about that enough. But I guess I might as well ask the question because it's just about exactly that. What does Toronto have to do to win a playoff game and get to the playoffs in 2023?
Okay, so to get to the playoffs, they just have to stay healthy. They are a very, very good team, and I think you used the word underrated earlier, and I think they are the most underrated playoff team right now before the season even starts, which is fine. It's great. They're going to surprise a whole bunch of people, except everybody who's been following them for a long time. Uh, they will they'll win the division. I think they're going to, because the Yankees. First of all, last year. I didn't buy into the Yankees season, and I don't know why, because the wins and losses were right there in front of my face. But I just think they were playing above their heads. This year, they're starting. They're starting already with injuries, and I think that's going to be their Achilles heel all year. So I can see the Toronto Blue Jays winning the division at say 96, 97 wins.
Gotta love that. Gotta
Yeah,
love that, especially with the new AL East, so new schedule changes, and only have to
right.
playing them 13 times. That's also a good win as well. All right, obviously we know that you are over here on the OK Baseball podcast. You'll be joining again once the season gets started and we're done with all these team previews. But many might not know, and they might be listening because of the Blue Jays preview, that you run jaysfromthecouch.com. A lot of good Blue Jays content. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. JaysFromTheCouch.com. We've been going for almost 7 years now. We've got our podcast every Monday evening, 6 p.m. on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. You can catch us there, joining the conversation. If you love your Blue Jays that much, join us and talk about them. The audio version is available everywhere you find podcasts. And of course, all of our content at jaysfromthecouch.com.
Awesome. And for Blue Jays fans, you also got a Facebook group, right?
We do. Facebook group, Blue Jays Talk for All. If you're interested in talking about your Blue Jays in an environment that doesn't talk down to you, like we know everything, come on over and talk with us at Blue Jays Talk for All on Facebook.
Awesome. Gotta love that. All right, Sean. Well, thank you for coming back to the show. I'm excited that you're back here, and I'm looking forward to having you back on the night before opening day. While we get our
Can't wait.
flagship episodes back in, we're going to get our predictions there, all that good stuff. But we're going to wrap it up here at OBP. Thank you so much for listening in. We'll be back here with another episode. Team previews are continuing, so continue to look at your feed. We're dropping at least one a day, sometimes multiple. So just continue to hit that refresh button, pull it down like you're doing on Twitter, do whatever you got to do. But we'll see you back here next time. Take care.